The first time Adam passed the gas station, he didn't think much of it. A rundown little stop on the side of an otherwise empty stretch of highway. The neon sign buzzed weakly, casting a sickly blue glow on the pavement. Inside, a lone cashier leaned on the counter, absently flipping through a magazine. The second time he passed it, he glanced at the GPS. Still another 100 miles to go. Must have been a different station, same brand. He drove on. The third time, his fingers tightened around the steering wheel. Same neon flicker, same empty lot, same cashier, now staring directly at him through the glass. Adam swallowed hard, shaking off the unease creeping up his spine. He was tired, that was all. Highway hypnosis. Long stretches of road could play tricks on the mind. He turned up the radio, static crackling, before a voice broke through. "Long drive tonight, huh, Adam?" His foot jerked on the gas pedal. The car swerved slightly before he steadied it. His heart hammered. The voice on the radio was smooth, familiar, like someone he should recognize but couldn't quite place. He stared at the dial, AM 1600. He hadn't set it to that station. He reached to turn it off. "Wouldn't do that if I were you." His breath caught. He snuck a glance at the gas station as he passed again. The cashier was outside now, standing just at the edge of the road, watching him, not waving, not moving, just watching. The next few miles, Adam focused on the road ahead, white-knuckling the wheel. He wouldn't look at the station next time, wouldn't acknowledge it. It wasn't real, couldn't be real. But the next time he passed, it had changed. The lights inside were off, the neon sign was dead, and the cashier was standing in the middle of the road, waiting. Adam slammed on the brakes, tires screeching as he swerved to avoid the figure. His pulse pounded in his ears. When he finally dared to look in the rearview mirror, the road was empty. The cashier was gone. Shaking, he gripped the wheel and forced himself to drive on. The radio crackled again, the same voice whispering, almost amused. "You should stop, Adam. We've been waiting for you." His skin crawled. He reached for his phone, desperate to call someone, anyone, but there was no signal. The GPS flickered, then reset itself. Distance to destination, 999 miles. That was impossible. His entire trip wasn't that long. He hit the screen, but it didn't change. The road stretched ahead, infinite and empty. Then the headlights flickered, the engine sputtered, and up ahead, the gas station's neon light buzzed back to life. Adam's breath hitched as the radio hummed again. A new voice joined in. "You should really stop, Adam. Don't be rude." He clenched his jaw, gripping the wheel tighter. He had to be hallucinating. He pressed harder on the gas pedal, watching as the speedometer climbed, 70, 80, 90 miles per hour. The trees blurred past, and he felt a sickening mix of adrenaline and nausea wash over him. And then the gas station appeared again. But this time, something was different. A second figure stood outside, next to the cashier. It was taller, wrapped in a dark coat, its face obscured in shadow. Adam's hands went clammy as the figure raised its arm and pointed directly at him. His vision swam. His stomach twisted into knots. "Adam," the radio voice crooned. "It's not polite to keep driving past your stop." He slammed his fist against the dashboard. "What the hell do you want from me?" Static hissed, filling the car. His headlights dimmed again, but this time they didn't come back on. For a few terrifying seconds, he was swallowed in total darkness. Then, a flicker. His car's interior lights glowed eerily, bathing everything in a pale blue. The engine purred at a low idle. The radio's volume turned itself up as if someone was adjusting the dial. "Adam," the voice said again. "Come inside." His hands shook as he gripped the door handle, knowing that if he stayed, the loop would continue. But if he stopped, a slow, creeping dread settled into his chest. The road ahead was gone. Only the gas station remained.
Lena always stayed late. She liked the quiet, how the office felt almost like it was hers alone. The hum of the air conditioning was soothing, and the empty desks, while lifeless, brought her a strange sense of peace. It was her time to catch up on work without distractions. Tonight, though, there was something different. The air felt heavier, as if the silence was thickening around her. She kept looking at the clock, counting the minutes until she could leave. Everyone else had gone home hours ago, yet she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. The tapping of her keyboard echoed through the empty office, but then a faint sound, a keystroke that wasn't hers. She paused, staring at her screen. The noise stopped. She exhaled, trying to shake off the creeping discomfort. The office was always a little strange at night, the way it seemed to settle into a life of its own. Maybe it was just the building shifting. She turned back to her screen, but the sound came again, a soft, distinct tap on a nearby keyboard. Her eyes flickered to the other desk, scanning the empty rows. She could swear she saw something move in the corner of her eye, a shadow that wasn't hers, lingering just beyond her line of sight. She blinked, and it was gone. It's just exhaustion, she told herself. Too many late nights. But then the sound of typing started again. This time it was unmistakable. A deliberate rhythm, the type of typing only someone present could do. Lena stood, her chair squeaking as she pushed it back. She walked toward the desk from where the sound was coming. The computer was on, but the screen was dark. No one had been there. No one had entered the office since she'd locked up the front door hours ago. Lena leaned closer to the monitor, her reflection appearing faintly on the screen. It was then that she saw it, words. Typed in an old word processor, the kind that wasn't even connected to the network. "I see you, Lena." She jerked back, her pulse racing. She stared at the words, but before she could react, they disappeared. The screen went blank, as if the computer had never been touched. Had she imagined it? The office felt colder now. The quiet was suffocating. She tried to shake off the unease, but something kept pulling at her, a feeling that she was being watched. Lena sat back down at her desk, trying to focus on her work. But every few seconds, she caught a glimpse of something, movement in the reflection of the window behind her. It was too quick to identify, just a shadow darting across the corner of her vision. She turned around. Empty. Her phone buzzed on the desk. Lena snatched it up, but there was no message, just an odd notification. "You're still here." Her fingers froze over the screen. How had the phone even received that? There was no signal. She hadn't been connected to Wi-Fi since before the office closed. But the message, it didn't feel like a mistake, felt like someone or something was trying to tell her something. Suddenly, the typing started again. This time, it was louder, more insistent. Lena's breath caught in her throat. She turned toward the source, but this time, it wasn't from any desk. It seemed to be coming from inside the walls themselves. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest. She stood, slowly backing away, eyes darting to the cubicles around her. The lights flickered. She reached for the door. It was locked. The typing stopped. The silence was crushing, suffocating. She turned toward the windows again, but this time the reflection wasn't just of her. The shadow in the glass seemed to move with her, mimicking her every movement but with a slight delay. It didn't seem like her own reflection at all. It looked wrong. Lena felt a chill run down her spine as the shadow in the window's reflection raised its hand. It pointed directly at her, and in that moment she could have sworn it wasn't her pointing. She turned around, the air thick with dread. The office was still. Too still. She stared at the entrance door, locked as it had been. But then something new caught her eye. A figure standing at the far end of the office, at the edge of the hallway. She didn't move. The figure didn't move. It was only then that she realized the reflection on the glass wasn't just mimicking her. It was her. But the person standing at the end of the hallway wasn't. It was a stranger, tall, with indistinct features as if the shadow itself had taken form. The air felt cold, impossibly cold. A sudden voice crackled through the office's intercom system. Low, distorted, almost a whisper. "Lena, why do you stay?" Her legs froze, unable to move. She stared at the figure in the hallway, but when she blinked, it was gone. In its place, another flicker of movement in the corner of her eye. Something was wrong. The office itself felt wrong. The typing began again, closer now. Right beside her desk, Lena turned slowly. The screen on her computer was on again. This time the words weren't disappearing. "You never left." The clock on the wall had stopped moving. The room seemed to stretch in an unnatural way, as if the walls were slowly closing in. Lena took a step backward, her breathing ragged. The lights flickered once more, and when they came back on, she was no longer alone. When Rachel moved into the apartment building, it seemed like a good deal. The rent was cheap, and the location, while not perfect, wasn't bad. The building had seen better days, but it wasn't completely falling apart. Yet, as the weeks went by, something began to feel wrong. At first, it was the silence. The building had always been quiet, but Rachel soon realized how unusually quiet it was. The hallways, which should have been filled with the usual noise of neighbors coming and going, were eerily still. The elevator barely moved, and when it did, it felt as though it hadn't been used in years. She didn't think much of it at first. People moved in and out of places all the time, but it wasn't long before she noticed the emptiness. The tenants she did see were strange. They moved through the halls like shadows, glancing over their shoulders or standing still for too long, staring at the walls. Some of them barely acknowledged her when they passed, and others muttered strange words under their breath, words that didn't make sense. One evening, as Rachel returned home from work, she noticed that the door to the apartment across from hers, Unit 3A, was slightly ajar. She hadn't seen anyone come or go, but the door was open. Curiosity gnawed at her, but she quickly shook it off, attributing it to a neighbor being careless. Still, the door stayed that way for days, swinging slightly with every gust of wind. A few nights later, Rachel was sitting in her living room, reading, when she heard it, a muffled whisper coming from the vent in the wall. At first, she thought it was just the building settling, the sound of old pipes shifting or air moving through the ducts, but then the whispers came again. This time, they were clear enough to make out a few words, too faint, too fast to fully comprehend, but definitely there. The tone was unsettling, like a chant or a warning. She tried to ignore it, but the whispers continued for days, growing more distinct each time. One night, as she stood in her kitchen, she heard them again, louder, closer, like they were coming from inside her apartment. But when she checked every room, there was no one. The apartment was still, empty. Rachel started to notice more strange things. The hallway lights would flicker when no one was around, the bulbs dimming and brightening for no reason. The other tenants, what few remained, moved like automatons, never looking up, always shuffling past without a word. The woman in 2B, who had once seemed friendly, now always stared straight ahead, her eyes wide, unblinking. The man in 4C hadn't left his apartment in weeks, his door left open, but never any sound coming from inside. And then there was the layout of her apartment. Rachel had lived in the building for a few months now, but the more she explored, the more she realized something wasn't right. The rooms felt off. Not in a way she could explain, but in a way that made her feel dizzy and disoriented. She had lived in this same apartment for weeks, but sometimes she could swear the corners of her kitchen were different, the hallway longer, the door to the bathroom too narrow. The layout was changing, shifting. One night as she lay in bed, the whispers came again. This time, louder than ever, so loud she couldn't ignore them. She jumped up, her heart racing, and threw open the door to the hallway. The lights flickered again, and the air felt thick as though something was pressing down on her chest. In the dim light of the hallway, she saw them. The tenants, all of them, standing silently outside their apartments, facing her door. No one moved. No one blinked. They simply stood there, staring at her. A man in 5A raised his hand, pointing at her. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. The whispers grew louder, closer. Louder still, until they were no longer whispers, but a deafening roar. Rachel backed away, her breath shallow, her skin crawling. And then a voice broke through the cacophony. A voice that was hers, but not hers. A voice that came from the walls. "You should have left when you had the chance." Rachel's pulse raced as the hallway stretched out before her, the walls closing in. She looked down and saw the same message, scrawled on the floor in dark red. "Leave. Before it's too late," but the hallway shifting. It moved. The doors to her neighbors' apartments no longer aligned with the hallway they should have been on. Rooms and doors appeared where they hadn't been before. The building itself was alive, shifting, distorting, closing in on her. She turned, but the doors behind her were gone. There was only one direction now. Forward. With no other choice, Rachel ran. She didn't know where she was running to, but she had to escape. The building seemed to pulse with a life of its own, as though it was feeding off her fear. She heard footsteps behind her. No, not footsteps. Shuffling. Something was following her. The whispers, now a chorus of voices, filled the space, each one calling her name, urging her to stop. But she couldn't stop. As Rachel reached the stairwell, she stumbled, her heart in her throat. When she looked up, the door at the top of the stairs was gone. The hallway stretched into infinity, And then she understood the tenants were never real. She was the one who didn't belong. The building wasn't haunted, it was hungry.
It was supposed to be a fresh start. Erin had just moved into the apartment complex a week ago. The rent was cheap, the location convenient, and the building, despite its age, seemed livable enough. But from the moment he stepped into the place, something felt off. He couldn't quite place it, but there was a heaviness in the air, like the building was holding its breath, waiting for something. At first, he blamed the building's age. The floors creaked underfoot, and the pipes groaned at odd hours. But it was more than that. It was the strange behavior of the other tenants. They never made eye contact. They walked in silence, often at odd hours of the night. The woman in 5C never turned off her light, even in the middle of the day, and the man in 2A always left his door ajar, but no one ever went inside. Erin tried to brush it off, focusing on getting settled in. But then it started. The feeling of being watched. It began subtly. Small things. Footsteps in the hall when no one was there. The distinct sound of a door closing behind him when he was sure no one had entered the hallway. At night, it felt like the walls themselves were breathing, and sometimes he swore he could hear muffled whispers coming from the vents. One evening, after a long shift at work, Erin came home to find a strange note slipped under his door. It was simple, written in a hurried hand. Room 4B is not empty. Don't trust the walls. He didn't know what to make of it. He'd never heard of anyone living in room 4B, but the building had been nearly empty when he moved in. Maybe it was just a prank from one of the other tenants trying to spook the new guy. But then the dreams started. Every night, Erin dreamt of the same thing. A hallway, stretching infinitely into the dark. He walked down the corridor, always drawn toward room 4B. The door was ajar, and he could hear soft, echoing whispers coming from within. When he tried to open it, his hand froze just inches from the doorknob, as if something unseen was stopping him. Each night, the dream became more vivid. The hallway seemed more oppressive, the air thicker, and every time he woke up, he felt a sense of unease that lingered long after. Something was wrong in this building, and whatever it was tied to room 4B. After days of unsettling dreams, Erin decided to investigate. He waited until the building was silent, the quiet after midnight when most tenants were asleep. He slipped out of his apartment, his heart pounding as he made his way down the hallway. The building was suffocatingly still, the air thick with the scent of old wood and dust. When he reached room 4B, his breath caught in his throat. The door was cracked open. He hadn't noticed it before, but now it was clearly ajar. The whispers were louder now, more distinct, like a group of people having a hushed conversation just behind the door. He pushed it open. The room was dark, but it was familiar, too familiar. It looked almost identical to his own apartment, but the layout was subtly wrong. The walls seemed too close, the hallway stretching unnaturally, and the window was missing its usual view of the street. Instead, it showed a thick fog swirling outside. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, Erin felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He was sure no one lived here. Yet, there, standing by the window, was a figure. A man in a long coat, his face obscured by shadows. The figure didn't move. Erin stepped back, his heart racing. He was sure he hadn't seen the figure enter. He had never heard the door open. But there it was, like it had always been there, waiting. The whispers grew louder, as if the room itself was alive, pressing in on him. He glanced around, but the door to the hallway had disappeared, replaced by another dark corridor stretching into endless darkness. "You should leave," the figure said, its voice low and raspy, like it was coming from a great distance. Erin felt a cold rush of panic. He turned to run, but the hallway was now impossibly long and the door to escape was gone. The walls pressed in closer, the room itself shifting, its layout changing again. It wasn't the same apartment anymore, it was something else. Something twisted. The figure stepped closer. "You're not supposed to be here." Erin tried to scream, but no sound came out. His legs felt heavy, like they were being pulled down by unseen hands. He stumbled forward, reaching for the walls, but they were soft now, like flesh, pulsating under his touch. The floor creaked, and before he could react, the building around him began to shake. The lights flickered, and the whispers grew louder, blending into a deafening roar. The air in the room was thick with tension, as if it was alive, consuming everything around him. In that moment, Aaron realized the terrible truth. The building wasn't just empty, it was never empty. The tenants had never really left. They were all still here, trapped in a cycle that no one could escape, and now he was a part of it too. Ben had always been drawn to old buildings, the kind with history, the kind that creaked with stories of lives lived long before he was born. That's why, when he found the apartment in the aging building, it seemed like the perfect place to settle down after the breakup, after everything that had fallen apart. The rent was low. The landlord was quiet but polite. The apartment was small but cozy, with wide windows that let in the morning sun, despite the building being tucked in an older part of the city. But something was off. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just the odd noises in the middle of the night. A tapping, a scraping, like fingernails running along the walls. Ben had chalked it up to the building's age. But the more time passed, the more he started to feel a cold presence, a sense that the building was watching him. Then there was the hall. The hallway outside his apartment was long and narrow. The lights never seemed to stay on for long, flickering erratically as if the building itself was struggling to stay awake. But it was more than that. Sometimes Ben would come out of his apartment to find that the hallway had shifted slightly. The doors no longer aligned the way they had been before. A familiar door now opened to a different apartment than it had before. The building felt malleable, like it was always changing just out of sight. But tonight was different. Ben had been awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, listening to the strange sounds in the walls. The sounds had changed. They weren't just tapping now. It was more like a deep scratching, like something trying to claw its way out. The noises were coming from inside the walls. He'd checked earlier, sure that something was behind them, but there had been nothing. Empty space, no creatures or pipes, just air. He rose from his bed, the dark apartment feeling heavier than usual. Something wasn't right. The air was thick, pressing in on him. The hallway outside felt darker, the light from the single bulb at the end of the hall barely making it past the doorframe. He grabbed his coat and stepped into the hallway. The sound was louder now. It was coming from the walls, but from more than one spot, scratching like something desperate to get out. Ben's heart began to race. He was paralyzed for a moment, staring down the long corridor. Every door was closed, but the silence between the scratching sounds was unbearable. He could almost feel the walls moving, pulsing like they were alive. "What the hell is that?" he whispered to himself, stepping further into the hallway. Then it came. A figure. A shadow. At first, he thought it was just his eyes playing tricks, a trick of the light, but as he blinked, it became clearer. The figure was standing at the far end of the hallway, just inside the shadows, watching him. It was tall, unnaturally tall, its limbs too long, its body almost bent in a way that seemed wrong. Its face was too dark to make out, just a blank space of darkness where eyes should have been. Ben froze, heart pounding. He wanted to run, but his legs wouldn't move. The figure stepped forward, its movements jerky, unnatural, as if it were crawling through some unseen space. And then it spoke. "You shouldn't be here, Ben." The voice was low, almost guttural, but it sounded like his own voice, distorted, as though the building had learned to speak with his fears. In a blind panic, Ben turned and ran back to his apartment. He slammed the door behind him, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The apartment was dark, suffocating, scalas, the walls pressing in tighter. He could still hear the scratching, louder now, more frantic. He pulled out his phone, no signal, not that he expected any. The building had never allowed him to call out. Then the scratching stopped. Silence. For a few seconds, nothing. Then came the whispers, faint but growing louder. They came from everywhere, above, below, behind. They were in the walls, the floor, the air itself. The whispers weren't words, just sounds, like dozens of voices all at once, filling the space, distorting into a cacophony of panic. "Let us out. We've been waiting." Ben stumbled backward, his vision blurred, his head spun. The walls were moving again, not just shifting, but breathing. The entire building was alive, and it was hungry. He ran to the bathroom, hoping for some refuge, but when he opened the door, the walls inside weren't the same as they had been before. The mirrors were cracked, shattered into pieces, their reflection twisting, warping. In the mirror, there was a face, his face but distorted, its eyes empty black holes. Ben screamed. He couldn't breathe. The air was thick, suffocating. The building wasn't just a place. It wasn't just old bricks and pipes. The building was something else, something old, something hungry. He could feel it pulling him, drawing him closer to the walls. Something was inside them, watching, waiting. He turned to the door, desperate to leave, but it was already closing in on him. The door slammed shut, locking him inside. The whispers grew louder, and then, as if the building had taken its final breath, it stopped. The silence was worse than the noise. It was heavy and suffocating. Ben stood there, staring at the walls. But he wasn't alone anymore. There were others in the mirrors now, others who had disappeared long ago, and the walls kept breathing.